Welcome everyone this morning. It's nice to see everyone dialing in again. Obviously, for those of you who've been kept in touch with this, I've been delivering regular webinars. I think the first one we might have done was towards the end of 24, actually. So we've been doing regular ones throughout this period to prepare for the new clinical trial regs and the GCP update. The most recent ones I've delivered have all been with my colleague Gamal from the approvals team. Unfortunately for us, but luckily for his new employer, he has moved to a new post in England, so they're very lucky to have him. So I will be delivering this solo this morning, and whilst I will still be covering some approvals topics, I won't be able to go into the same detail that Gamal would. But if anyone's got any specific questions around approvals, do share them at the end, and if I'm unable to answer them, I will find them out through my colleagues in the approvals team and in the HRA to respond to those for you. But to get started, so what I'm going to be looking at today is I'm going to give an update on the current position with the new clinical trial regulations and GCP. And I'll start with a general recap. So for anyone that's here thinking I've not kept in touch with this over the last year and you're only just getting involved now, for those people out there who are usually close to my heart, I tend to, a deadline is what makes me do things. I will give a full update, a recap for everyone there as well. So we're all on the same page, and then move on to sort of where we are, where the latest movements may have been, and also what may not have changed since last time, so that you know exactly where we are. I'll then also give you an update on training requirements and the options for that. So my role is that I am the Good Clinical Practice Training Manager for Health and Care Research Wales, and I'm a GCP lead for Wales, and I'm the deputy for the GCP lead group across England and Wales as well. So I'll be giving you that full update on that as well, and I'll then give you that update on the current position on the planned changes coming in with the approvals process, and I'll finish with plenty of time for questions at the end. I'm aware a couple of questions have already been submitted, which is great, and then obviously I'll leave that to the faculty team to manage that, who always manage it so well. Just having a check. Oh yeah, I can see there's a couple of messages there in the chat box that Claire has shared for everyone to have that up-to-date information. Okay, so I'm going to start off on that update on the current position with the clinical trial regs, and then for those of you that have just dialed in, I'm going to do a little recap just to start with in case anyone here isn't fully familiar or just doesn't feel as confident in it. I'll give you that little overview of what the changes are and why they've come in, and then any what's happened most recently to them. So basically, we were working to, or at the moment, we're in the middle of what's called a 12-month implementation period. So from around this time last year, these changes were announced. They don't go fully into force until next month. I'll look at the deadline with you and the date for that, sorry, not the deadline, shortly. So we are technically, we're working to these at the moment, but we'll be changing. So we're working to the Medicines for Human Use Clinical Trial Regulations 2004, sometimes just called the Clinical Trial Regs. It's the same thing, just a sort of name, and GCP R2, and these are changing or will be next month to the Clinical Trial Regulations 2025, and GCP will be changing to R3. And the key difference between the two of those that always helps people have that little guideline there is these apply just to the UK. This is UK law on how we run clinical trials, and by clinical trials in this setting we mean drug studies, and GCP is a global standard. So this sets the standard for how clinical trials should be run globally, and then each individual area, region, country will have their own law that is set and governed by this, and this is what the MHRA inspect against. Now, there are a few very tiny minor areas where something in GCP may differ slightly from what our new regulations say. There is guidance available on those, and they're very, very specific niche areas, and in that situation we follow the clinical trial regs, but for the vast majority we probably wouldn't even notice those differences there. So that's what we're moving to, from GCP R2 to R3, and from the clinical trial regs 2004 to those 2025. So it's the biggest change we've had in regulation in the last 20 years. So it is a really significant change for us. And whilst I've mentioned clinical trials is for drug studies, a lot of the changes that are coming into this will be fed into non-drug studies. And I've got a little bit of an update on that coming up at the moment, because there is some guidance available for those of you on non-drug studies. And just to say as well, I'm going to try avoiding jargon, because I'm aware I've probably got a mix of people in here who are very experienced with the jargon and those that may not be. So I'm using the term drug studies, non-drug studies, but you may also see the terms CTIMP, non-CTIMP coming up in the slides as well. CTIMP, clinical trial of investigational medicinal project, that's drug studies. Non-CTIMP, all other kinds of research. Okay, so 28th of April, that's our date. So as I mentioned, we're still in our 12-month implementation period at the moment from when these were introduced last year. From the 28th of April, those new clinical trial regulations and the new GCP will be fully in force in the UK and will be fully adopted. So that means if you are inspected by the MHRA from the 28th of April, it will be in line with these new regulations and with this new GCP. It is important to note that the MHRA have said, and I was in a webinar with them just last week. I don't know if anyone else dialed into that, but they're very pragmatic about this. They are aware that it's, people won't be absolutely 100% perfect from the 28th of April. They're looking for what we've put in place, what practices we've put in place, how people are prepared for this. And it's that, that pragmatic approach to, well, obviously we're not expecting everyone to be 100% perfect, but what's in place, how can we improve that? How can we make sure we're working towards achieving this as much as possible? The other key thing to note as well is this 28th of April is not a deadline to complete updated GCP training by. And again, this has come directly from the MHRA, who are the inspectorate body in the UK. So they are the ones that are, make those decisions. They're the ones that put these regulations in for the UK. So I will give a little bit more information shortly on the training requirements and what options are available, but it's not a deadline for everyone to update their GCP training by the 28th of April. It is a requirement for the GCP training to be updated, even if, say, you only did it a year ago, because it's a significant change in GCP. So if your role requires a GCP certificate, you do need to update your training. It does not have to be bang on by this deadline, though, if that is not feasible for you or is causing challenges in your research team. So the MHRA have said they want this to be completed in a risk proportionate way. So those staff working on higher risk studies, for example, should prioritise completing this training sooner. If your study, either your existing study is like to have significant changes as a result of these, or you've got a new study coming in that's going to be quite different from previous studies as a result of these new regs, then obviously you prioritise changing in training in those areas as well. But as I said, this is a message that's come directly from the MHRA, and also in the webinar I attended just last week, again, they said they're not expecting everyone to be fully up to date and everyone have to complete it by that 28th of April deadline. I'm just putting a link in the chat there if anyone needs that written down, so you can bring that up in team meetings, or if you've got, I know a lot of people have told me their sponsors are saying, but you have to do it by this deadline. If it is a local requirement by your employer or your sponsor, then obviously you follow your local requirements. But if in some cases that's actually causing challenges or difficulties or limitations in your study, you may consider it appropriate to, contact your sponsor and discuss that. And that link there has some clear wording in it around the expectations of when GCP training should be updated and how. There's also wording on NIHR Learn that's released throughout the NIHR throughout England as well. So that message is mirrored across us all. So I'm just going to go through the reasons for the updates. Again, this is just for those that maybe want that little bit more detail. So basically, these changes to the clinical trial regs and to GCP encourage a greater risk-based approach, which basically means those lower risk studies that we're running, the pragmatic low risk studies that, for example, those that carry no greater risk than usual clinical care, should be easier to set up and run, so that the regulations and the processes we have in place are supportive and not burdensome. But those higher risk studies have those higher measures and purposes in place to protect the participants and to protect the research data as well. So it's that risk proportion way. We want to have those really high security, high quality measures in place, but not in a way that they are burdensome to low risk studies. So it's that proportionate approach. It also supports innovation, recognizing the fact that we've got much more modern trial designs coming through, things like decentralized methods, use of real world data, that kind of thing. So it's about future proofing those regulations to allow this greater innovation in our research. It is also about consistency. So obviously, because we know GCP is coming in as that global standard, the update to GCP, the UK clinical trial regs are consistent with that. It's about providing that flexibility, which links in with that risk-based approach there, so you can adopt that risk proportionate approach to trial oversight. So those higher risk studies have those greater measures, those lower risk studies have enough measures to keep them safe, but not so many that it is burdensome to the study running, because we want to be able to run those low risk studies quickly and easily. Linked in with that efficiency as well, by having that efficient approach, we can by having that flexible approach, we can have much greater efficiency. For example, in the trials approvals process, if you have a drug study that is very low risk, no more risk than usual clinical care, it doesn't make sense for it to go through the same lengthy approvals process via the MHRA as a phase 1 novel drug study. So it's about that efficiency there. Data integrity, again, recognizing that a lot of the way that we run clinical trials has changed in recent years. We've got a lot more technological advances coming in as well. So it's about recognizing that data integrity, a lot of different computer systems coming in. Huge parts of the GCP update are specifically to computer systems and validation. And also there's that there's an enhanced focus on inclusion as well, which comes from the Declaration of Helsinki and GCP as well. So this slide here, you'll notice some of the slides I'm delivering have the NIHR logo on. That's because they've come from an NIHR training update on the clinical trial regs that I've worked in collaboration with them in delivering. And some of them have our logos on because it's a mix of what I've added and what I've used from there. So this is actually updated from their previous slide. So the webinar I attended yesterday with the MHRA and the HRA. I've updated that in relation to some of the information they put out in that. So they had a really nice slide at the end of their training that summarized all of the key changes and had some really nice points in it. So I've updated this to reflect that. So the key changes coming in is applying for clinical trial approvals. And again, these specifically applying to those approvals for drug studies, but I will talk in a moment about the changes to non-drug studies as well. So the way that teams are seeking that approval, I mentioned that for those very low risk drug studies, there's a different route to getting that approval through the MHRA for that. It's called notifiable trials, so that you can set up and run those ones more quickly while still maintaining that higher checks and security in place for higher risk studies. There's also a change to how we're applying to modify clinical trial approval, and we'll pick up on that word modification in a moment. There's changes to safety reporting and pharmacovigilance. These primarily, it's unlikely that those of you working at site will particularly notice many changes around that. That's primarily looking at changes around sponsors requirements, and the aim is to remove duplicate safety reporting requirements. So we still have that really high quality aspect, but where perhaps things are being duplicated in different areas, it's being that duplication is being removed. There's changes on how a clinical trial will be ended as well. So that is around the sort of timelines lapsing, that kind of thing. Changes to transparency, which we've mentioned quite a bit over the last few ones. So that's transparency around when you are opening a new clinical trial. It has to be registered in a publicly available database, a World Health Organization recognized database. This was always done previously, but it's now a legal requirement. And historically, drug studies would have used the UDRACT database for Europe. Obviously, post-Brexit, not as relevant now. So they have to be on there. Also, findings of the study have to be published and made publicly available, and that includes offering a lay summary to research participants as well, which is a really key change. And then finally, the last one, which sort of lumps in lots of different aspects together, consent and other changes. So consent There's changes to very low-risk clinical trials, again, those that carry no more risk than usual care, that are working with drugs that are already licensed, that would be prescribed anyway to a patient. And if you want to gather a little bit more data on that, we're not doing anything extra to them. There's guidance and regulations in place to allow a simplified means of seeking and evidencing that consent. And there's very clear guidance available from the HRA on that to be very specific and ensure we're protecting people taking part in that. Again, it's there to try and help those really simple, pragmatic, low-risk studies to be opened up and run more easily, so we're able to get those studies running more often. Other changes include an extension of the definition of who can be a PI in a study or an investigator in a study, which I've got a slide coming up in a little bit where we'll look at that. And that would also sort of apply across similar considerations to who may be suitable to assess eligibility or conduct consent, which we'll look at in a little bit. Very key part of that is that it's hugely risk proportionate, so it wouldn't be appropriate for that to be a non-medic in high-risk drug studies, for example. There's also changes around clinical trial requirements legally apply to labs and computer systems, not just to how people delivering the studies is specifically. There's changes to labeling for investigational medicinal products, and there's guidance available on that. They've also reintroduced an old new category called NIMPs, which is non-investigational medicinal products as well. So that's been reintroduced, and there's labeling guidance available for that as well. So that is licensed drugs that are as part of the study being administered alongside the CTIMP, for example. But there's more guidance available on that. And archiving has been extended. So clinical trial records will now be expected to be archived for 25 years. Minimum, some studies may still need to be greater than that. There's some changes to wording and definitions as well. So we've moved away finally from subjects to participants. This has been a long-standing change. It should have changed years ago because we don't subject people to research, they participate in it. So that's changed, although I think the vast majority of people I work with would never use that term when working with participants. It's just written in the regulations, or was. Trial site changing to trial location to recognise the fact that when it's not always a physical site when we're working with remote studies. I will just come back to that in a moment. Amendments, as I touched on, are changing to modifications. So we're moving away from that, and that applies to all study types, not just drug studies. So instead of just the substantial, non-substantial amendments, you'll have 3 categories of modification coming in there. Very similar to what it was before. And essential documents, the term there changing to essential records to recognise that they're not always a physical document. It may be, we're using a lot more electronic systems and data and metadata, for example, that maybe the term records is a bit more appropriate than documents. But the key thing to note here as well is that these terms won't be fully replaced. I know in the GCP training circles, we've been painstakingly trying to change any reference to site to location and documents to records. Similarly, site files, questions around that. These terms will probably will still be in use. There's a debate at the moment around how and why that should be changed and if it should be changed. So you will see these terms used across the board as well still. One of the other key changes that's coming in, the clinical trial regulations have always had a very strong risk focus. This is still in there, and there's probably just more detail on it now. So there's a strong focus on what we call critical to quality factors. That's basically identifying key areas of research study that may have those aspects that, as the name suggests, are critical to the quality. So things that, the risk areas, the areas that if we don't manage this absolutely in X, Y, and Z way, this could have a risk to our data quality or to our participant safety. So we have to be aware of those areas. And it's something that's always been done quite strongly anyway, probably a key part of most of your feasibility assessments, looking for those critical to quality factors and how we can run that study safely and effectively. So it's always been happened. And actually, from chatting to an MHRA inspector recently, she said to me, well, whenever we do an inspection, what we tend to do is sit with people from the study team and ask them, we'll go through the protocol with them and ask them to identify, what are the sort of risk areas here? What are the things that are really mindful of to make sure this is run in the best possible way? And that's basically looking for the critical quality factors. So it's not particularly different to what was happening anyway. And linked into that is the importance of risk. Now, when we started delivering all of this at the start of that 12-month implementation period, we were being told that there was a strong focus on sites doing risk assessment. As you probably will have heard from updates previously, there's been a bit of a shift on that now. And so whilst risk is still a really key part of this, the responsibility for conducting trial-specific risk assessments sits with sponsor. So sponsor will be doing those risk assessments. The MHRA doesn't want every individual site doing their own risk assessments in addition, because it was felt that that could cause delays and unnecessary work and burden on them. If, as a site, there is something unique to you that may be different to other sites, that may mean that, the sponsor's risk assessment may be slightly different. So, for example, during the pandemic, there were a number of, trial sites, trial locations that were recruiting participants in unconventional settings. So instead of a clinical setting, they might have been using a sports hall, for example. So you probably would want to adapt your risk assessment relating to that specific change there. So it's just about being aware of what might be different in your particular individual area. But there should be proportionate approaches to research delivery, and these are encouraged. And as we said, that may result in variations locally, but the differences will be clearly outlined in study protocols. Research delivery staff should be supported in understanding and embracing these variations and where those changes may be. And it must be recognised that initiating independent local level risk assessments is not expected, as I've already said. So it's not a requirement for sites to do their own individual risk assessments, just to be aware of what may be different and specific to your area from the standard risk assessment, and have that conversation with sponsor, which is something you probably would have been doing already anyway during feasibility. And we've got this little quote here, again from the NIHR in collaboration with MHRA and HRA, again just saying that we're not expecting local sites to do their own trial-specific risk assessments. And this links back to what I said there. So if there's anything different in your site from others or from the standard protocol, then you would have that conversation there to manage that risks, those individual risks associated with it. And it should be noted, though, that the risk assessments do still play an important role in the development of a trial location or trial sites' standardised practices via development of their overarching quality system for trial conduct. So as we said, again, this is a direct quote here, as we said, there are trial requirements there for risk assessments still going. One of the other key changes I've mentioned before earlier on today, and I've mentioned throughout the others, this hasn't changed, this is staying the same. The definition of who can be an investigator, and by investigator that means PI and or CI in the UK. So it used to be quite a limited list. It's now been hugely expanded. This isn't an exhaustive list. It's basically doctor, nurse, dentist, pharmacist, and it has to be a suitably qualified nurse for that. And then we've got optometrist, and then people on the Health and Care Profession Council. And these subsequent ones are those, you've got the HCP Council lists here that are on there. You've also got chiropractors and anaesthetist associates, for example. So that's been hugely expanded. It has to be detailed in the study protocol who can be a PI on that. So if it says on the protocol it has to be a medical doctor, then it has to be a medical doctor. We can't go for another one. But if the study protocol, if the approved protocol lists a different role as PI on a clinical trial, then that is permitted. But do check your local policies, because some local policies will not allow that, even if that individual study protocol and the regulations do. And then there's just a little bit of addition around that just says, if an investigator, a PI or a CI on a clinical trial is doing that, they have to be appropriately trained to undertake it, and they will need appropriate support for any medical decisions. So it might be that they can be PI, but they can't make certain types of decisions without medical input from that. So it's about having that awareness of what your protocol says and what your local policy allows as well on that. And whilst this specifically aligns with drug studies, obviously for non-drug studies, again, following what your protocol says about how can be a PI and your local policies on that. And then this slide just gives us a little bit of an overview of some of the timings that are coming in, just so you have an awareness of some of those changes around that. So I mentioned before about study closures and changes to there, which comes in here. So if you've had a clinical trial approval in place for a study and 24 months that hasn't recruited, that approval lapses. So there's changes there as well. Changes again here, again, this would apply for those of you in sponsor. So this isn't to do with sponsor informing sites about urgent safety measures. This is sponsor informing MHRA, and it's increased to 7 days in line with global standards. But there would still be that requirement for them to inform sites within old standards as soon as possible. Archiving has increased to 25 years, as I said. Request for further information deadline is now 60 days from when notice is given. So that's during that approvals process, during a study setup. We mentioned that the transparency requirements, that a trial has to be loaded onto a database. So that has to be done either before the first participant recruited or 90 days after approval, whichever comes first. And publish the trial summary of results within 12 months of conclusion of the trial. And that includes that offering of the lay summary to participants. So those are some of those key changes coming in, and since the last update I've given you, there hasn't been very much change or movement from those. They've stayed fairly static. As I said, the only change that's come during this 12-month period to all of that significant change has been risk. It's still there very much, but we're not expecting sites to do their own risk assessment. And as I mentioned earlier on, there's a little bit of a debate around some of those language changes, those terminology changes, and what's still going to be used. So there's some guidance documents available, which I've mentioned quite a lot today. So obviously you've got GCP and you've got the clinical trial regs, but even me, who lives and eats and breathes GCP, sitting down and reading the whole document is quite challenging to take it all in. So there's clear guidance out there on how to apply GCP and regulations into practice. So I'm going to share some links in the chat for you. So these aren't static. In the webinar I attended last week, they were saying, it is likely to be updated as the clinical trial regs settle in. They may be making some updates and changes to the guidance as they see how that applies in real life and where people may need that little bit more information or support on aspects. So the HRA has published guidance specific to the clinical trial regulations, and this is really helpful guidance here. So I'm going to pop the link in the chat there. So I do recommend bookmarking these because they can be a little bit hard to find on the website sometimes when you want to find it quickly. So do save them in your favorites. So that's specific around, they've got guidance there on definitions and terminology around safety, around approvals for drug studies, those simplified arrangements for consent that I mentioned, changes around research ethic committees that review clinical trials, and research transparency. So you've got those changes in there. And the MHRA guidance is still in process. So most of it is available now. So I'm going to just share that link in the chat for you now. So there's a lot of guidance already on there, but there's more to come. So the aim was for it all to be there by now, and there's obviously a huge piece of work for them to be doing, and so that's still in process. There's more to come before the 28th of April deadline there. And as I said, it's not static, so they are going to be making those changes as we see that those clinical trial regs bedding in. They may be updating that guidance basically in response to what people need and want to ensure they are able to deliver these to their best standards. In addition, we've now had guidance published for non-CTIMPs, so that's non-drug studies, because everything I've talked about so far has been related to drug studies. And I've had quite a few people saying, well, how does this apply to non-drug studies? What's going on here? Because a lot of it is best practice. Obviously, GCP doesn't legally apply to non-drug studies, but it is often seen as the gold standard. So you've got some really clear guidance there on non-CTIMPs and how to do that. And that includes update to amendment terminology. So they're letting people in non-drug studies know we're moving from amendment to modification. That's across the board for all drugs, all study types. Updates to the approvals process for non-CTIMPs, which I will touch on approvals shortly. But the updates, although that's been triggered by the clinical trial regulations, every study type will have a new approvals process, and it's in process. The process is in process at the moment. It also includes guidance on modifications. So they've got one piece of guidance around the change from amendments to modifications, and then they've got one about how you apply for modifications. So again, I'd recommend bookmarking this if you're working on those types of studies, because you don't want to get to the stage where you need to submit a modification or you're receiving one and you can't remember how it all works. So bookmark it so you can read that easily. And those research transparency requirements. So we've mentioned that they apply legally to drug studies. So there's guidance on how these should be applied to non-drug studies as well. The link's there on the slides, but as I said, I've popped that in the chat for you so you can access it there. Okay, I'm going to move on now to look at the update on training requirements and the options available, because I know I've mentioned, the GCP training requirements, so I'll look at that in a moment for you. Okay. So new GCP training must be completed after any significant change, and this is deemed a significant change. It's the biggest change in the last 20 years. So it will be a requirement for people to update their GCP training, even if you only did it a year ago. It will need to be updated, but that should be proportionate to your role. And as I mentioned earlier on, it is not a deadline. So that 28th of April when the new regs and GCP come in, is not a deadline for completing GCP training by. The MHRA are very pragmatic about it and recognise that there are many different that it needs to be done in a risk proportionate way. So those of you that are working in the higher risk studies, if there's sites or teams where maybe more errors are happening than should be, then they may be prioritized for that training. If you've got a new study coming in, or you've had changes to a study as related to this the new GCP, then you'd be prioritizing that. So the MHRA's information is saying it should be completed within a reasonable time frame of the new regulations being put in place. So we would recommend within 6 to 12 months, and again in that risk proportionate way. So those that are higher risk, prioritizing that training. If your sponsor or your employer are making a requirement to complete that training before the 28th of April, then you're following your local policy. But as I said at the start, I think a couple of people may have joined me after I started saying that, so I'm just going to pop another link back in the chat again if anyone missed it. We do have a document, some information on our website that I'm just popping in the chat for you there, and that specifically mentions when GCP training needs to be updated by and the timelines around that. So if you do have a sponsor who is demanding it's done before the 28th of April and that's not feasible or achievable for you, or it's causing issues, then you may want to go back to them and say, well, it isn't actually a requirement to do it by that deadline. There's also information on NIHR Learn about that, but ultimately it's a local decision on when your training should be done. And I would say as well, think about when those updates will need to be done. So if all your staff are trained in March 2026 and your local policy requires GCP to update it every 2 years, you're going to have a bit of a headache in March 2028. So have if you can have a little think about how you can manage that, just to make the 2 years time a little bit easier as well. So the different GCP training options available. So if GCP is required for your role, and I will say there's a stronger focus now on the fact that GCP is technically only required for those on drug studies. I'm aware that a lot of sponsors or local employers may still make it a requirement for GCP training to be completed. And there is a shift across the UK around that, in trying to make sure people are aware that you don't have to do GCP and there are other options available. Ultimately, it comes down to that local sponsor and employer decision. But if GCP is required for your role, you've got the introduction to GCP for those that are brand new to research. That is available as an e-learning on NIHR Learn. If you've already previously completed your introduction to GCP and you need to do your GCP certificate update, there's the GCP refresher that is available. That is available now as an e-learning. It is also about to be available as a facilitator-led course. So that means a face-to-face session locally, or a live Teams session delivered as well. And that certificate will be just as valid. So people can choose either the e-learning or the facilitator-led. Both provide a valid GCP certificate. We also have the optional GCP consolidation, which basically complements the introduction. So it's for those new to research, or perhaps for those where, they might have been in research for a while, but they just need to get a greater grasp of the basics. They want that greater depth of understanding. It's a facilitator-led course. It's delivered again as face-to-face sessions or live sessions via Teams. And we are seeing this being listed in MHRA inspections now as an action. If they're seeing a lot of basic errors happening, then they may recommend a team complete their GCP consolidation training to get that greater depth of the basics. It may also be used in CAPAs. There's also an add-on e-learning on NIHR Learn called GCP for Imp Management. So for those people that have the highest level involvement with IMPs, investigational medicinal projects on a study, you do your introduction and you may need this add-on as well. So that's available now, the updated version on NIHR Learn. If you do not require, if your role doesn't require GCP technically, then there may be alternative training options available for you. So on NIHR Learn, we've got these two e-learning courses here: research practice in clinical settings, research practice in wider healthcare and community settings. That's basically for those on non-drug studies, if you're in a clinical setting, if you're in a non-clinical setting. In Wales, in addition to that, we have our Good Research Practice Workshop. So it's essentially GCP for non-drug studies. So it's a simpler version of that, and it's got a strong social care focus. That is available as face-to-face and live virtual training, and dates are already on our website. We also have in Wales our research awareness fact sheet. That's for those people that just need the very basic awareness. So maybe a receptionist in a research active GP surgery, and it can be used in-house to get the very basic aspects of research across, and that's available on our website too. And then there's also research practice courses for specific roles that are available on NIHR Learn. So if you've got staff working in labs or in pharmacy, but they're only doing very minor parts of the study, it may not be appropriate, and it may be, a bit over the top for them to do the full GCP. And so NIHR Learn has specific simplified e-learning for these groups, specific to these areas, to labs and pharmacy as well. And we will be updating our website to make these options really clearly available. And NIHR are working on an online decision tool to have on NIHR Learn to guide people into what training is available for them, because we are aware it's a lot to take in. But what's available right now for those that need to do that update? The GCP Introduction e-learning is available now on NIHR Learn. That was available from December, so that's brand new, and that's R3 compliant with the new GCP. The GCP Refresher e-learning is also available now on NIHR Learn. That was released last month, so anyone that needs to update with the new GCP, it's available there. And the GCP Refresher Facilitator-led is available from April. So we have dates on our website now from May for people to attend that. Even if you have already completed your e-learning, you're still welcome to attend that face-to-face one if you want that greater depth. You want a human being who can talk through it. And it's a really nice, very practical exercise. You'll often have, with any of the face-to-face ones, the consolidation or the refresher will have things like a badly completed delegation log for people to look through and spot where the errors are and what the implications are of that. So it's that really practical side of things that helps people understand it. We have safety reporting scenarios, and how would we categorize this? So it's a really practical aspect. So that's coming. And then also in April, we've got that GCP consolidation that I mentioned, which isn't a requirement. It's an optional add-on, provides a certificate. It is CPD badged and can be used as a recommended action in MHRA inspections or CAPAs as well. And this is just giving an overview of all the training that is available, just so you know what we've got. So on NIHR Learn, they've got all of these specialist modules, many of which have been updated already in line with the changes. Some are still being updated. And we've got additional specific training that we offer here. So we've got our own e-learning modules on our website, and we've got our facilitator-led training, which is either available face-to-face or via Teams, or a mixture of option of both for those. So we've got a range of those different courses available. So we offer the consolidation and refresher in Wales. We offer the principal investigator workshop. We offer valid informed consent in research, which for many health boards is a requirement. We offer managing essential records and good research practice, which is that GCP for non-drug studies, essentially. This slide just lists some of those useful links, and I've shared most of those in the chat already, and I can share them again towards the end. I'm just moving towards the end now, so I'm going to look at that update on the current position with planned changes to the approvals process. So for those that only just didn't hear me at the start, I've been delivering this webinar throughout last year with my colleague Gamal from the approvals team. He has moved on to a new role elsewhere now, which is sad for us, but very fortunate for them. So I won't be able to go into as much depth on approval, but I will give you the updates. If you have any questions and I'm unable to answer them, I will go away and find out those answers from our approvals team for you. So what we're going to cover, and I've based this on some of the information he had available last time, and some of the information I've just heard from the MHRA and HRA. As most of you are probably aware, IRAS will be going, and it's going to be replaced by something called Plan and Manage Health and Care Research. It's being replaced because some of the requirements and changes that are coming in, IRAS just can't support it. It's not possible for it to support it. So this new system will come in that will have the background to enable that to be supported. And it's being released in stages. So there'll be some studies or some changes that we put in place that, sponsors will be invited to put it through this system, so that these this process can be worked out until it's fully rolled out to everyone. So that's the key change that's coming in there around approvals, but the guidance documents I've put there will give that greater information around that, with those greater details for those around it. And this slide has come from the MHRA and HRA, and it's just covering the different application routes under the new regulations. So in current practice, for example, your initial application is combined review, and new regulations is combined review again. The MHRA process ultimately will be combined in with the ethics and HRA Health and Care Research Wales approval. Eligibility best approval of initial application. You've got different aspects here from the current practice and new regulations. Assess trial changes. So we've mentioned amendments, changes to modifications. So you've got different aspects here. So amendments, we used to have substantial and non-substantial. These are going to modifications. You will have substantial modification, route A, route B, and you've got minor modification. You also have modification of an important detail. So you've got those different aspects going in there as well to be aware of.